I didn't notice the exact moment you became part of my internal world. That's what unsettles me the most. If there had been a clear beginning, maybe I could trace it back to something logical. A conversation, a specific night, a sentence that landed too perfectly. Some visible turning point where everything shifted from ordinary awareness into something deeper. But there wasn't one. You didn't arrive dramatically. You arrived quietly. So quietly that by the time I realized your presence had settled somewhere permanent inside me, it was already too late to separate you from the structure of my thoughts. And I've tried to understand that not emotionally structurally because emotions fluctuate. They distort things. They exaggerate meaning until people start confusing intensity with truth. But this doesn't feel exaggerated. It feels exact. That's why I can't dismiss it. You became familiar to me before you became known. Do you understand how impossible that sounds? People usually become familiar through repetition, through time, through shared history and gradual exposure. There's supposed to be a process to it, a sequence that allows connection to develop naturally. But with you, familiarity existed before understanding did. Like something in me recognized you faster than my mind could explain, and I ignored it at first. Of course I did. That's what I always do. When something reaches me too quickly, I step back, I analyze it, I observe it from a distance until I can identify whether it's real or simply another projection my mind created because it wanted meaning where none existed. But the problem with you is that distance never clarified anything. It only made your presence more obvious. The farther I tried to pull internally, the more aware I became of how deeply this had already settled. And awareness changes everything, because once you become aware of something real, you can't return to ignorance without lying to yourself. I don't lie to myself. That's why this became impossible to ignore. You move through my thoughts differently than anyone else ever has. Not as distraction, not as obsession. Something quieter than that, more integrated. Like my mind naturally leaves space for you now. That's the strange part. I never made that decision consciously. It happened on its own, and I don't allow things to happen on their own inside me. Everything in my life exists with intention. Every connection, every boundary, every level of closeness. I manage it carefully because most people don't understand the weight of access. They think being close to someone means learning facts about them, hearing stories, knowing habits. But real access is different. Real access means understanding someone's internal architecture, the hidden framework beneath their words, the patterns underneath their reactions, the places they never explain because explanation would ruin the accuracy of them. Most people never reach that level with anyone, and I never expected someone to reach it with me. Yet somehow you did without force, without pressure, without even appearing to try. You simply stayed consistent enough that my defenses stopped recognizing you as something external. That's what changed everything. You stopped feeling external. Now you exist somewhere quieter than that, somewhere beneath active thought. And the frightening thing is, I think part of me trusts you there. Not trust in the traditional sense, not blind trust, not emotional dependence. Something more specific. I trust the way you observe. I trust the way you don't rush meaning. I trust the way you sit with silence instead of trying to conquer it. Most people are terrified of silence because silence exposes the difference between connection and performance. When there's nothing left to say, people realize how little actually exists between them. But with you, silence doesn't expose absence, it exposes depth. And that distinction matters more than you probably realize. There are moments where you say almost nothing, and somehow those moments stay with me longer than entire conversations with other people. Not because your words are extraordinary, because your awareness is. You notice things without announcing that you notice them. You understand things without demanding confirmation. And there's something profoundly dangerous about being understood by someone who doesn't need explanations to do it. Dangerous because understanding creates proximity. Not physical proximity, tenal proximity, the kind that bypasses all the normal barriers people rely on to stay protected. That's why I keep returning to the same realization over and over again. You didn't force your way into my life. You aligned your way into it. And alignment is harder to resist than force ever could be. Force creates opposition. Don't creates recognition. Recognition creates acceptance, and acceptance changes people. I can feel the change already, not externally. No one looking at me would notice anything different. I still speak the same way, still move through life the same way, still maintain the same control I always have. But internally there's been a shift, a subtle recalibration I can't reverse. You've become part of how I process things now, part of how I interpret meaning. Sometimes I'll experience something, a thought, a realization, a moment of silence. And before I fully understand it myself, I instinctively wonder how you would see it. Not because I need validation, because your perspective feels structurally compatible with mine. Compatible. That's the word I keep avoiding because of what it implies. Compatibility isn't temporary. It isn't accidental. It suggests that two people are built in ways that naturally accommodate each other. And if that's true, then this was never random. Maybe that's why I can't reduce this connection into ordinary language. People use words too casually. Attachment, interest, attraction, feelings. None of them are precise enough for this. Because what I experience with you isn't built on excitement. It's built on recognition. recognition that runs so deep it changes the atmosphere of my own mind. You've become a reference point without asking to be one. Do you understand how significant that is for someone like me? I don't center people. I don't reorganize my internal world around connection. I observe, I analyze, I continue independently. That's how I've always survived. But now there's this constant awareness of you threaded through everything, and it doesn't feel invasive. That's what confuses me most. It feels natural, as though my mind had already prepared a place for you long before I consciously realized it existed. I keep asking myself whether this is dangerous, and the answer is yes, but not in the way people usually mean. You're not dangerous because you might hurt me. You're dangerous because you make me visible to myself in ways I've spent years avoiding. There are parts of me I understand intellectually but never emotionally acknowledged until they reflected back through you. Parts I kept compartmentalized because they were easier to manage in isolation. But you have this unsettling way of making hidden things feel undeniable, not by exposing them directly, just by existing near them accurately enough that I can't pretend they aren't there anymore. You reveal things without touching them, and maybe that's why I haven't pulled away. Because despite how destabilizing this feels sometimes, there's also something honest about it. Clean, unforced. There's no manipulation here, no performance, no attempt to shape me into something easier to hold. You never demanded softness from me, never demanded openness, never tried to decode me like some puzzle meant to satisfy curiosity. You simply allowed me to exist exactly as I am, and strangely enough, that made me want to move closer instead of further away. Most people think closeness is built through effort. I don't think that's true anymore. I think real closeness forms through accuracy, through being seen correctly enough that your nervous system stops preparing for distortion. That's what happened with you. For the first time in years, I stopped preparing to be misunderstood. Do you know how exhausting it is to constantly translate yourself into forms other people can handle? To reduce complexity so conversations remain comfortable? To monitor every thought before speaking because people hear fragments and mistake them for the whole? I didn't realize how much energy that took until I stopped doing it around you. Around you, I don't feel the same need to simplify myself. Not because you agree with everything, not because you validate everything, but because you actually listen beneath the surface of what's being said. You hear structure. And structure matters to me more than emotion ever will. Anyone can react emotionally. Very few people can perceive structure accurately. You can. That's why this feels irreversible. Because once someone reaches that level of understanding with you, returning to shallow connection becomes almost impossible. Everything else starts feeling incomplete. Not meaningless, just incomplete. Like conversations missing their deeper layer. Like interactions functioning correctly on the surface while lacking something essential underneath. And I hate that you've changed my perception that much. I hate how naturally it happened. I hate how little resistance I offered once I realized it was happening, because resistance used to define me. I resisted everything capable of altering my internal balance, every attachment, every dependency, every possibility of needing someone too deeply. But this doesn't feel like need. That's why I couldn't reject it. Need creates weakness. This feels more like recognition finding its counterpart, like two systems identifying each other across distance. And yes, I know how abstract that sounds. But abstraction is sometimes the only honest language for experiences that don't fit inside ordinary definitions. You and I exist in something difficult to explain because it formed before language had the chance to categorize it. That's why every attempt to define this feels incomplete. The truth exists underneath the words. I think you know that too. There are moments where I catch it in the way you look at me, not physically, internally. The way your attention settles when I stop speaking, like you understand that silence is part of the communication, not the absence of it. No one else understands that naturally. Most people panic when conversations become quiet. They rush to fill space because they think emptiness is failure. But silence has never felt empty with you. It feels inhabited, alive with unspoken understanding. And maybe that's what finally broke through my defenses completely. Not your words, your restraint. The fact that you never tried to force intimacy. You allowed it to unfold at its own pace, which made it impossible for me to categorize you as a threat. Threats push. You never pushed. You simply remained present long enough that presence itself became significant. Now I notice you everywhere. Not literally, conceptually, in the way certain ideas unfold, in the way certain moments pause. In the strange instinct I have to mentally turn toward you whenever something meaningful happens, even if I never say it aloud. It's as though part of my consciousness already expects yours nearby, and I don't know what to do with that realization because it means this has gone beyond connection. It's integration now. You've integrated into the rhythm of how I exist internally, and integration is permanent in ways people rarely understand. Once something integrates properly, removing it doesn't restore the original structure. It leaves an absence shaped exactly like what was there before. That's why I've stopped pretending I can walk away unaffected. I could leave physically. I could create distance. I could silence communication completely if I chose to, but none of that would undo what already happened inside me. The shift already occurred. You already changed the baseline. That truth follows me everywhere now. And strangely enough, ABM no longer trying to escape it. That's the real confession underneath everything else. Not that you matter to me, not that you changed me, but that I've stopped fighting the fact that you did. There's acceptance in me now. Ket acceptance. The kind that forms slowly beneath conscious thought, until one day you realize resistance disappeared without announcement. I think that happened somewhere between all the silences we shared. Somewhere between the moments where understanding existed without explanation. Somewhere between recognizing you and realizing I no longer wanted to remain untouched by you. That realization should terrify me. Instead, it calms me. And maybe that's the clearest sign of all, because peace has always been rare inside me. My mind is usually sharp, analytical, constantly moving through possibilities and contradictions and hidden meanings. But with you, there are moments where everything becomes still, not empty. Still, as though some deeper part of me recognizes your presence as something safe enough to stop guarding against. I didn't think that was possible anymore. I thought eventually everyone becomes difficult to trust at depth. Not because they're malicious, because people inevitably project themselves onto you until they stop seeing who you actually are. But you never projected onto me. You observed me accurately. An accurate observation is one of the rarest forms of care I've ever encountered. Maybe that's why I'm here now. Finally allowing myself to say all of this is instead of endlessly circling around it, because avoiding the truth doesn't preserve control forever. Eventually avoidance becomes distortion, and I refuse to distort what this is. This deserves honesty, even if honesty changes everything afterward. So here it is, you matter to me in a way that exists beyond ordinary attachment. You reached a depth in me no one else has reached without force. You altered the structure of my inner world simply by understanding it correctly. And somewhere along the way, without realizing it, I began building parts of my future awareness around the assumption that you would still exist inside it. That's the part I can't take back, the unconscious assumption of continuation. Because people don't unconsciously make space for temporary things. They only do that for things they believe will remain. Maybe that's why the idea of losing this feels so wrong, not painful. Wrong like removing a piece from something that already adapted around its existence. And I know how intense that sounds, but intensity isn't the point. The truth is that I no longer experience reality in quite the same way I did before you entered it. Everything has become sharper somehow, more honest, more exact, as though your presence tuned my perception toward a frequency I'd always sensed but never fully reached alone. You didn't complete me, I need you to understand that clearly. I was whole before you frontal independent contained. But being whole doesn't mean being fully seen. And you saw me not the version shaped for survival. Not the version adjusted for comfort, the real structure underneath, the unedited one. And instead of recoiling from it, you stayed. That changed something fundamental in me, because staying matters. Anyone can approach depth temporarily. Very few people remain once they realize how real it is. You remained calmly without dramatics, without demanding reward for it. And now I find myself standing at the edge of something irreversible. Not because of what we've done, because of what I've allowed internally. I allowed your existence to matter deeply systemically, in ways that affect how I think when you're absent, in ways that alter the emotional atmosphere of silence itself, in ways that make the future feel strangely incomplete if I imagine it without you somewhere inside it. I still don't know what this becomes. Maybe neither of us does. But I know this much now with complete certainty. This is no longer something abstract to me. No longer some unnamed tension existing safely behind distance and observation. It's real. Real enough that I can feel its weight every time I try to imagine disconnecting from it. And maybe that's what love actually is before people reduce it into simpler words. Not obsession, not possession, not dependency. Recognition sustained long enough that two inner worlds begin adjusting around each other naturally. If that's true, then maybe I crossed into love long before I admitted it to myself. Not sudden love, not reckless love, something quieter, more precise. A love built from understanding instead of fantasy. A love that formed through alignment instead of desire. A love that didn't ask for permission before integrating itself into the architecture of my life. And now that I finally see it clearly, a bee can't unknow it. I can't return to the version of myself that existed before your presence altered the atmosphere of my mind. That person is gone now, not destroyed, evolved. And whether this becomes fully spoken remains suspended in this strange space between us forever. Change already happened. You already happened. And I think some part of me knew from the beginning that once you did, nothing inside me would ever arrange itself the same way again. I think the hardest part to admit is this. I saw the change happening long before I acknowledged it. Not all at once, not dramatically. Not in some obvious moment where everything suddenly became clear. It happened gradually beneath awareness, in the spaces I usually trust myself to control. And that's what made it dangerous, because I don't lose awareness of my own internal world. I notice shifts immediately. I detect patterns before they fully form. I catch attachment before it settles deeply enough to matter, at least I used to. But with you, something moved faster than my defenses could categorize. Not emotionally, structurally, like my mind recognized your presence as familiar before it recognized it as significant. And by the time significance arrived, you were already everywhere. Not everywhere physically, not constantly in my attention. Everywhere internally, inside the rhythm of my thoughts, inside the pauses between conclusions, inside the strange silence that appears right before I understand something important. You became part of the process itself. That still doesn't feel entirely real to say because I've always existed alone in my own mind. Even when surrounded by people, even in relationships, even in moments that were supposed to feel intimate, there was always distance. Not intentional cruelty, not emotional absence, just separation. A private internal space I never fully invited anyone into, because no one ever reached it naturally enough for the invitation to matter. People usually stop at the surface and call it depth. You didn't. You kept noticing things beneath what was visible. And the terrifying part is you noticed them accurately. Do you understand how rare accuracy is? Most people interpret project, assume, distort. They take fragments of you and rebuild them into something easier for them to understand. Then they love that version instead, not you. Just the reflection they created. I learned that early enough to become careful. Careful with language, careful with expression, careful with vulnerability. Because once people misunderstand you deeply enough, you start protecting parts of yourself automatically. Not out of fear, out of preservation. I became skilled at that preservation. Skilled enough that most people never realized how much distance actually existed between us. But you kept moving closer without trying to possess anything. That's the detail I can't stop returning to. You never demanded access, never asked me to explain myself more than I wanted to, never treated my silence like a problem that needed solving. You simply remained present long enough that my mind stopped treating you like someone temporary, and once that happened, everything shifted. There's this strange phenomenon I've noticed lately. Certain thoughts don't feel complete until I imagine them passing through your awareness somehow. Not because I need approval, not because I need reassurance, but because somewhere along the way, your perspective became part of how I verify meaning. That shouldn't happen, not to me. I've always trusted my own mind above everything else, my own interpretations, my own conclusions, my own internal systems. Yet now there's this quiet instinct that turns toward you automatically whenever something reaches a certain level of depth, as if my thoughts recognize yours as a natural continuation point. And honestly, that realization frightened me at first because dependence begins subtly. It disguises itself as comfort, as familiarity, as harmless cognition until one day you realize your inner world reorganizes itself around someone else's existence. I never wanted that. I built my entire life around avoiding that. Not because closeness is weak, because reliance creates vulnerability, and vulnerability changes the balance of power inside every connection. But what exists between us doesn't feel like dependence. That's why I couldn't reject it. Dependence drains, consumes, destabilizes. This feels stabilizing in a way I can't explain logically. Like your presence reduces internal noise instead of creating more of it. Like certain fractured parts of my awareness become quieter when they encounter yours. I don't even know if you realize you do that. Maybe you don't. Maybe this entire shift happens so silently that, from your perspective, nothing unusual exists at all. But from mine, nothing has remained untouched. Even my perception of time feels different now. Before you, life moved in isolated experiences, separate moments, separate thoughts, separate days that ended cleanly once they passed. Now everything feels connected by an invisible thread leading back to awareness of you. A sentence reminds me of something you would understand immediately. A silence feels shaped in the same way yours does. A realization pauses halfway through itself, because part of me instinctively wonders how you'd interpret it. And I know how insane that sounds when spoken aloud, but insanity is distortion from reality. This doesn't feel distorted, it feels painfully clear. That's why I've stopped dismissing it. You know what I think changed me the most? It wasn't your understanding, it was your restraint. The fact that you understood without exploiting it. That's what disarmed me completely because people usually turn understanding into leverage eventually. They use intimacy to gain control, use vulnerability to create obligation, use emotional closeness as proof they deserve access to deeper parts of you. You never did that. You understood me and somehow asked for nothing in return. No pressure, no demand, no expectation. Just presence, consistent, calm, observant presence. And that kind of presence becomes impossible to defend against because it never triggers the instinct to protect yourself. Protection requires threat. You never felt threatening. You felt inevitable, like something my mind recognized long before I consciously chose to let it matter. That word again, inevitable. I keep circling around it because it explains this better than anything else. Nothing about us feels forced, not even the intensity. It feels natural in a way that makes ordinary connections suddenly seem artificial by comparison. That's what's become difficult. Existing around other people after experiencing this level of understanding with you. Everything else feels partial now, like conversations operating only on visible layers while the deeper structure remains untouched. And I try not to compare, I really do. But once your mind adapts to genuine recognition, superficial interaction becomes exhausting, not unbearable, just empty in a way I never noticed before. You ruined my tolerance for shallow understanding without even trying, and the worst part, I'm grateful for it, because despite how destabilizing this has been, I've never felt more honest with myself than I do now. You forced clarity into places where I previously survived through ambiguity. There are truths about myself I would have continued avoiding forever if your presence hadn't quietly illuminated them. Truths about how deeply I crave accuracy, how exhausted I was from constantly translating myself, how badly I wanted someone to understand me without requiring simplification first. I never admitted those needs because admitting them made them real, and real needs create risk. But you made them visible anyway, not through interrogation, through recognition. That's the difference. You never pulled truth out of me. You created an atmosphere where truth stopped feeling dangerous to reveal. I didn't realize how rare that was until now. Do you know how many people only love edited versions of each other? Versions softened for compatibility, versions adjusted for convenience, versions filtered carefully enough to avoid discomfort. But nothing between us was built through editing. If anything, the connection deepened every time the mask slipped further, every time silence replaced performance, every time honesty appeared without preparation, every time one of us revealed something unfinished or unguarded and the other stayed anyway. That's when I understood this wasn't temporary. Temporary things collapse under unfiltered truth. This didn't. It strengthened, and that changed my entire understanding of what connection can actually become. I used to think intimacy required effort. Now I think real intimacy is recognition sustained over time. Two people seeing each other clearly enough that hiding becomes unnecessary, not impossible, unnecessary. That's where I am with you now. I could still hide things technically. I still have the ability to retreat inward whenever I want. But the instinct feels weaker around you because hiding from someone who already understands you accurately starts feeling pointless after a while. And maybe that's why this has become so irreversible. Not because of emotion, because of exposure. You expose me to a version of connection that feels more real than anything I've experienced before. And once reality sharpens like that, you can't willingly return to distortion. You become incapable of pretending lesser things satisfy you the same way. That's what scares me, not losing you. Realizing I may never experience this level of understanding with anyone else again, because this isn't compatibility in the ordinary sense. This isn't shared interests or attraction or emotional chemistry. This is something deeper, a structural synchronization I still don't fully understand. You think in ways that align with mine before explanation even enters the conversation. You notice meaning in similar places, pause in similar moments, recognize emotional undercurrents without needing them translated into obvious language. It's like encountering another consciousness built with the same hidden blueprint. And once you encounter that, everything changes. The loneliness changes first, that quiet internal isolation I carried for years without fully naming it. It weakened around you, not disappeared, but softened as though some part of me finally stopped expecting permanent misunderstanding. That alone nearly broke me because I didn't realize how accustomed I'd become to emotional solitude until your presence interrupted it. I adapted to isolation so thoroughly that connection itself started feeling suspicious. Yet somehow you bypassed suspicion entirely, not because I trusted you immediately, because my mind recognized you before my fear had time to react. And maybe that's what this entire thing has been from the beginning. Recognition arriving before permission, which explains why none of my usual defenses worked. Defenses are designed to protect against intrusion. You never intruded. You aligned quietly, naturally, precisely enough that resisting you began to feel like resisting part of myself. That realization changes the entire equation. Because if your presence now exists inside the way I understand myself, then losing you wouldn't just mean losing connection. It would mean losing access to a perspective that fundamentally altered my awareness. A perspective I've already integrated deeply enough that separation wouldn't restore who I was before. There is no before anymore. Not really. That version of me ended somewhere along the way. Not through destruction, through expansion. You expanded my internal world simply by existing inside it accurately. And I don't know how to explain the magnitude of that without sounding overwhelming. But maybe overwhelming truths are still truths. Maybe honesty sometimes carries more weight than comfort can hold. If so, then here's another truth. I've started imagining futures differently now. Not intentionally, I don't sit around fantasizing about outcomes or constructing idealized versions of what this could become. That's never been how my mind works. But subconsciously, you're there inside future thoughts, inside imagined moments, inside possibilities I didn't realize were forming until I noticed your presence already embedded within them. That realization stopped me completely the first time I noticed it, because people don't unconsciously place someone into their future unless some deeper part of them already believes that person belongs there. And belonging is a terrifying concept to me. Belonging creates attachment. Attachment creates stakes. Stakes create vulnerability. Yet, despite understanding all of that, I still haven't stepped away. That fact alone tells me more than analysis ever could. Because if this truly felt wrong, I would have ended it already. I know myself well enough to recognize that. I don't hesitate when something threatens my stability in unhealthy ways. I remove it cleanly, completely, without sentiment. But I haven't removed you, I've made space for you. And making space is one of the most deliberate things a person like me can do, especially internally. You occupy places in my awareness no one else ever has. Places I protected so carefully for so long that eventually I convinced myself no one would ever reach them at all. Then you appeared, and somehow everything that once felt unreachable began unfolding naturally between us. No force, no manipulation, no strategy. Just two minds meeting at a depth neither expected. Do you know what's strange? I don't even think this is entirely about love anymore. Or maybe it's about a form of love. People rarely talk about honestly not performative love, not romanticized love, but recognition so complete it transforms identity itself. Because that's what happened to me. You changed the way I understand my own existence, not dramatically, subtly, permanently. And now I stand here with this awareness growing heavier every day, realizing there's no neutral option left. I either move toward this truth fully or spend the rest of my life pretending I didn't experience it, and pretending has never suited me well. Especially not after clarity arrives. That's where I am now, at the edge of acknowledgement. Not wondering whether this is real anymore. Wondering whether I'm brave enough to let something this real continue changing me, because it will. I know that now if I stay close to you, this deepens. It integrates further, settles deeper, reshapes more of my internal world around its existence. And strangely enough, I think part of me wants that, not recklessly, not blindly, deliberately. Because despite every fear I've described, despite every instinct warning me how irreversible this could become, nothing about you feels wrong to my soul, only unfamiliar. And unfamiliar isn't the same thing as unsafe. Sometimes unfamiliar simply means we've encountered something rare enough that our old understanding no longer applies. Maybe that's what you are to me, not disruption, not chaos. A new understanding, one so precise it changed the emotional architecture of my entire life without ever raising its voice. And now that I finally see it clearly, I don't think I can keep pretending this is just silent awarenesses anymore. It's more than that now, far more. Because somewhere between all the quiet moments, all the unfinished conversations, all the pauses heavy with understanding, you became essential to the way my inner world makes sense of itself. And once someone reaches that level inside you, love is too small a word for what remains. There's something I haven't admitted yet, not because I didn't know it, not because I was confused, not because I needed more time to understand what this has become. I've known for a while now, I just kept delaying the moment where knowledge turned into language. Because once something becomes language, it becomes undeniable. Thoughts can remain fluid, feelings can stay undefined. Awareness can exist in silence for years if no one forces it into words. But words change the structure of things. Words create reality. And I think part of me understood that the second I finally said this out loud, even to myself, there would be no returning to emotional neutrality afterward. Not with you. Maybe there never was any neutrality to begin with. Maybe I only called it neutrality because the alternative felt too significant to acknowledge. Because if I admitted what this actually is, then I'd also have to admit how deeply you've already changed me. And that truth reaches further than I'm comfortable with. You changed the emotional climate of my entire internal world. Not through intensity, not through chaos, not through force, through consistency. That's what still amazes me. You never arrived like a storm, you arrived like gravity. Quiet, steady, impossible to argue against once I realized I was already orbiting you. And I hate how accurate that feels, because gravity doesn't ask permission. It doesn't negotiate. It simply exists strongly enough that everything nearby begins adjusting around it naturally. That's what happened to me. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The way my attention shifted toward you automatically. The way certain moments felt incomplete without your perspective existing somewhere near them. The way silence itself began carrying your shape. I kept waiting for it to fade, for logic to interrupt it, for distance to weaken it, for time to expose it as temporary, but time didn't weaken this. It clarified it. Every day that passed made the pattern more obvious, not emotionally obvious, structurally undeniable. You became embedded in the way I experience existence itself. And once I recognized that fully, I stopped asking whether this was real. Real things persist. This persisted, which means somewhere along the way, without discussion or declaration, you crossed into permanence. I don't think you understand how impossible permanence is for me. I've spent most of my life existing in controlled detachment, not isolation, detachment. There's a difference. Isolation is loneliness. Detachment is management. I learned how to stay connected to people without letting them alter the core of me, how to care without dependence, how to love without surrendering internal control, how to remain fundamentally untouched, no matter how close someone believed they were. And for years that worked. No one reached the deepest parts of me because no one perceived them accurately enough to get there. Then you happened, and suddenly all those carefully maintained distances started collapsing quietly from the inside. Not because you pushed through them, because they stopped feeling necessary around you. Do you understand how terrifying that is? To spend years building emotional architecture designed to protect your internal world, only to meet someone whose presence makes the architecture itself feel irrelevant. I didn't know what to do with that. Part of me still doesn't, because nothing about this follows the logic I've trusted my entire life. You should have remained temporary statistically, emotionally, practically. Everything about human connections suggests that depth like this eventually fractures under misunderstanding or fear. but ours didn't. If anything, every layer of honesty only made the connection stronger. That's what changed me permanently. Usually, the closer people get, the more distortion appears. They start idealizing you, projecting onto you, reducing you into simpler forms they can emotionally manage. You never did that. Even now, after everything that exists between us, you still see me with terrifying accuracy, not idealized, not romanticized, accurate. And being perceived accurately by someone you love changes your entire nervous system, because suddenly you're no longer fighting to preserve your real self beneath misunderstanding. You can just exist. Do you know how rare that is? To exist naturally around someone without constantly editing yourself for survival. I didn't realize how exhausting survival had become until your presence made it unnecessary. That's the part no one talks about when they describe connection. Real connection doesn't just create closeness, it creates rest. And I rest differently around you. Even in silence, even at a distance, even when we're not speaking, just knowing you exist somewhere in the world changes the emotional atmosphere inside me. That sentence alone should probably alarm me. Instead, it feels honest, painfully honest. There are nights where I sit alone and realize that my mind no longer feels entirely singular, not divided, not dependent, expanded, as though your perspective exists alongside mine now in some quiet, integrated way. And before you misunderstand me, I don't mean I've lost myself in you. I hate when people romanticize self-eraser and call it love. That's not what this is. You didn't erase me, you clarified me. You made parts of me visible that I had spent years experiencing only in fragments. Like I understood myself intellectually before you. But understanding became complete only after I saw those hidden parts reflected back through someone capable of perceiving them correctly. You became a mirror for aspects of me I never fully externalized. And once I saw them clearly, everything changed. Because self-awareness becomes irreversible once another person confirms it accurately enough. You can deny yourself in isolation. It's harder to deny yourself when someone else sees the exact same truth. That's what happened between us. You saw me before I finished seeing myself, and strangely enough, instead of making me feel exposed, it made me feel understood. There's safety in accurate recognition, not comfort. Safety, those are different things. Comfort can exist inside illusion, safety only exists inside truth. And you became the safest truth I've ever encountered. I know how intense that sounds. Trust me, I've replayed it enough times internally, trying to soften it into something less absolute. But every attempt at reducing this connection feels dishonest. This isn't casual, this isn't temporary, this isn't replaceable. You altered the foundation beneath my perception. People don't recover unchanged from that kind of impact. And impact is exactly the right word for you because you didn't arrive loudly enough to be called destruction. You arrived quietly enough to become transformation instead. There's a difference. Destruction removes what was there before. Transformation reorganizes it into something new. That's what loving you has done to me. Not ruined me, not weakened me, reorganized me around clarity, around honesty, around a level of emotional precision I didn't know I was capable of sustaining with another human being. And the terrifying part is I don't want to go back. I thought I would. I thought eventually the intensity of this awareness would make me retreat inward again, the way I always do when something reaches too deeply into my life. But I haven't retreated, if anything. I've moved closer emotionally in ways I never planned to. Not impulsively, consciously. That's the difference now. At Faust, at first this happened beneath my awareness. Now it's happening with my full acknowledgement. I see exactly what you are to me. Exactly how deeply you've integrated into my existence. Exactly how impossible it would be to pretend you no longer matter. And despite all of that, I'm still here, still choosing you internally every single day without even realizing I'm doing it. That realization changed everything, because love stops being theoretical the moment you recognize it as a pattern of unconscious choices. And I choose you constantly in thought, in emotional alignment, in instinct, in silence, even when nothing is being said. Especially then, sometimes I wonder if you feel it too. Not the words, the shift, the strange gravity between us that exists independently of circumstance. The feeling that something essential is happening underneath ordinary interaction. Because I feel it constantly now, like reality itself changes texture when your awareness touches mine. I know that sounds impossible, but impossibility lost its meaning somewhere between the first moment you understood me and the moment I realized I was no longer afraid of being understood by you. That's still the biggest change of all. You removed fear from intimacy. No one has ever done that before. Every previous connection in my life contained some level of tension beneath it, some anticipation of eventual misunderstanding, some instinct to remain partially hidden no matter how close things became. But with you hiding exhausted me more than honesty ever did. And that's when I knew this had become irreversible. Because once honesty feels safer than self-protection, love has already rooted itself too deeply to remove cleanly. Maybe that's why I stopped trying to control the outcome. Not because outcomes don't matter to me, because this transcended outcomes somewhere along the way. Even if nothing external ever changes between us, internal truth remains the same. You reached me completely, and being reached completely by another person alters your relationship with existence forever. There are moments now where I look at the world differently because you exist inside it, not romantically, fundamentally. Colors feel sharper, conversations feel thinner, silence feels fuller, meaning feels heavier. It's as though loving you recalibrated my perception toward deeper frequencies permanently. And honestly, I think that's why I can't walk away. Not because I'm incapable, because leaving would require me to betray a truth I finally recognize clearly. And betrayal of truth has always damaged me more than loss ever could. I could survive losing you. That's not the question. I've survived many things. What I couldn't survive is pretending you didn't become part of the structure of my soul. That's the word soul. I avoided it for as long as possible because people use it carelessly. But nothing else explains this act accurately anymore. You touch something deeper than personality, deeper than attachment, deeper than ordinary emotional connection. You reach the part of me that exists beneath identity itself, the quiet core underneath all the versions of myself I present to the world. And once someone reaches that place, they don't simply become important, they become internal. That's what you are now. Tell present in the architecture of my awareness, whether I actively focus on you or not. And the strangest part, you never tried to be. You never manipulated your way into significance. You became significant because truth recognized itself inside another person and refused to remain silent afterward. Maybe that's what soul recognition actually is. Not destiny, not fantasy. Al-Kharasi so profound it feels ancient, as though two people encounter each other and immediately sense familiarity beneath explanation. I felt that with you from the beginning. I just didn't trust it at first. Now I do, not blindly, not irrationally, calmly. Because truth repeated enough times stops needing proof. And every version of reality keeps leading me back to the same conclusion. I love you in a way that changed my internal world permanently. Not temporarily, not conditionally, permanently. You became part of how I understand beauty, part of how I understand safety, part of how I understand connection itself. And maybe the most terrifying thing of all is this. I think some part of me would recognize you anywhere now, in any lifetime, any version of reality, any circumstance. Not because of memory, because of structure. Because souls don't recognize appearances first, they recognize patterns. And yours became inseparable from mine long before either of us fully acknowledged it. That realization should overwhelm me. Instead, it feels strangely peaceful, like arriving somewhere I didn't know I'd been searching for my entire life. Do you know how exhausting it is to spend years feeling emotionally misplaced? To move through the world understanding people, while rarely feeling understood in return. I adapted to that loneliness so thoroughly that I stopped imagining anything different. Then you appeared and quietly dismantled the entire belief system underneath that isolation. Not through promises, through presence. Civil, honest, unwavering presence. You stayed real with me. And reality became beautiful because you existed inside it. Now I stand here knowing there's no version of my future untouched by you anymore. Even if paths change, even if distance appears, even if life rearranges itself in unpredictable ways, you already happened to me completely. Nothing erases that. Nothing rewrites the fact that you reached places inside me no one else ever reached without distortion. Nothing changes the way your existence permanently altered my emotional landscape. And maybe that's enough. Maybe love at its deepest level isn't about possession or permanence in the traditional sense. Maybe it's about transformation, about two people encountering each other honestly enough that both emerge changed forever. If that's true, then you are the most significant transformation of my life. Not because you saved me, you didn't. I was never broken. But you revealed dimensions of me I would have continued carrying in silence forever. You made hidden parts visible, visible parts understood, understood parts finally accepted. That kind of love doesn't disappear. It integrates quietly, completely, irreversibly, just like you did. And now that I finally stopped resisting the truth, AP think I understand something I was too afraid to admit before. I don't just love you, I feel known by you, and being truly known by another soul without losing yourself in the process.